I don't remember the crash, only the sound of glass breaking and then nothing. But later they told me my car slid on black ice just miles from my son's house, the same house where he was hosting Thanksgiving dinner. And by the time the ambulance reached me, I was unconscious with internal injuries, and the doctors needed immediate consent for surgery. So they called my only son, the number I had memorized since he was a teenager. And while I was lying on a hospital bed with machines keeping me stable, he answered and listened for less than a minute before saying he didn't have time for paperwork, and that if I died, someone should just let him know, because he had guests arriving and couldn't deal with drama tonight. And when I woke up 2 days later, I didn't know any of this. I only knew the nurse looked at me like I was lucky to be breathing and told me someone had signed the consent forms for surgery, someone who insisted the doctors do everything possible, and I assumed it was my son until the nurse hesitated and said his name wasn't on the paperwork. And when I asked who it was, she handed me a clipboard, and I saw a name I hadn't seen in 15 years, a person I once helped when no one else would, someone I barely remembered. And as I stared at that signature, I realized my son had chosen convenience over me, but someone else had chosen me without being asked. When I asked the nurse who had signed the consent forms, she didn't answer right away. She just tilted her head like she was trying to decide how much truth a patient should hear while still hooked to IV lines. And then she told me the name was Maya Carter, a name that didn't belong to my family, didn't belong to any doctor, didn't belong to anyone my son had ever mentioned. And I stared at it until my eyes burned because I knew that name from another lifetime, from a time when I worked as a substitute teacher and let a quiet teenage girl stay in my classroom after school because she said she didn't like going home. And when I asked how Maya even knew I was in the hospital, the nurse told me she'd been listed as an emergency contact on an old file from the county volunteer registry, that she had updated her contact information years ago just in case. And when the hospital called every number they had on my records, she was the only one who answered and said yes without hesitation. And that was the first twist that hit me harder than the accident itself, because my own son had been too busy to pick up a pen. But someone I barely remembered had crossed town in the middle of a holiday storm to sign papers that would keep me alive. And while I was still trying to process that, my son walked into the room carrying flowers like they were a prop, telling me he'd been worried sick and traffic had been terrible and the hospital had mixed up some paperwork, and he talked fast, like he wanted to outrun the truth. And when I asked him if he signed the surgery consent, he paused for half a second before saying, "Of course," and the nurse standing behind him didn't correct him. But she didn't confirm it either. She just gave me a look that said I had the logs if I wanted them. And when my son sat down and told me he'd almost lost me, I realized he was rehearsing a version of events that made him look present. And that's when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that simply said, "Hi, Mrs. Helen. The hospital told me you're awake. I'm so glad. I'm Maya." And suddenly the room felt smaller because my son was talking about casseroles and neighbors while the person who actually saved my life was texting me from the hallway. And when I asked him where he was when the doctors called, he said he was hosting guests and didn't hear the phone. And that was another twist, because the nurse later confirmed he had answered. He had just refused to come in. And as he leaned over to adjust my blanket and said we'd talk about everything later, I smiled and nodded because I wasn't ready to talk. I was ready to listen, and the first thing I listened to was the sound of Maya's footsteps outside my room. Slow, nervous, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be here. And when she knocked softly and stepped in, I saw a grown woman who still looked like the girl who used to stay late in my classroom. And she told me she remembered the day I drove her home in the rain because she didn't have a bus pass, and how she kept my number all these years. and how when the hospital called, she didn't even think, she just grabbed her coat and ran. And in that moment, I realized something that would change everything. My son had inherited my blood, but Maya had inherited my kindness. And kindness, unlike blood, had shown up when it mattered. By the time the doctor came in to check my vitals, my son was already halfway through another story about how close he felt to losing me. And I noticed how carefully he avoided looking at Maya, who stood near the window with her hands folded like she didn't want to take up space. And when the doctor asked who had authorized the emergency surgery, my son answered before anyone else could and said, "I did." So casually it sounded practiced, but the doctor paused and looked at the chart, then looked at Maya and said, "Actually, Ms. Carter signed the consent forms when no family member was available." And the silence that followed was louder than any argument because my son didn't correct him. He just stared at his phone like the floor might open up and swallow the moment. And that was the second twist. Truth doesn't announce itself. It just shows up on official paperwork, and later that afternoon, a hospital administrator came in with a tablet and asked if I wanted to review the call log for my records, explaining that consent decisions are audited when patients recover. And when she turned the screen toward me, I saw the timeline laid out in clean rows. My son's name with a timestamp, a note that said, "Declined to attend," followed by Maya E.'s name with a note that said, "Arrived in person and signed consent." And I didn't feel anger in that moment. I felt something colder and clearer, like fog lifting off a road. And when I asked my son why he told me he signed the papers, he said he didn't want me to worry and thought it didn't matter who signed as long as I was okay. And that was the third twist. Because he wasn't ashamed of what he did. He was ashamed of how it looked, and while he stepped out to take a call, Maya sat beside my bed and told me she almost didn't recognize my name at first, but remembered my handwriting on an old card I once gave her, and how she'd tried to find me years ago to say thank you, but didn't want to intrude. And as she spoke, my phone started buzzing with messages from relatives who had heard about the accident through my son's Thanksgiving group chat. And one cousin forwarded me a message my son had sent saying, "Mom's in surgery, but I'm handling everything." And that was the fourth twist, because he wasn't just absent. He was rewriting the story while I was unconscious. And when the nurse brought me water and whispered that Maya had been asking questions about my recovery plan and insurance coverage, while my son was asking how long I'd be in rehab and whether my house would need to be sold to cover costs, I realized two people were planning for two very different futures. And that night, when the hospital social worker came in and asked who I wanted listed as my primary contact for discharge planning, I didn't hesitate. I looked at Maya and said her name, and the social worker nodded and updated the system while my son stood in the doorway pretending not to hear. And in that moment, I understood something that would quietly change everything. My son thought Thanksgiving was just another dinner, but for me, it had become the day I learned exactly who showed up when I couldn't. The next morning started quietly, but quiet doesn't mean simple, because while I was still recovering, the hospital ES discharge coordinator walked in with a clipboard and asked who would be managing my post-surgery care, medications, insurance communication, and physical therapy scheduling. And before I could answer, my son stepped forward and said, "I'll handle everything," like it was already decided. But the coordinator paused and said the system listed Maya Carter as my primary contact. And that shift in power was so subtle most people would miss it. But my son felt it immediately because his shoulders stiffened and his voice changed when he asked who made that update, and I told him I did. And then the coordinator added another twist by explaining that since Maya had signed the emergency consent and stayed present through the surgery, she was now recognized as my verified medical advocate unless I chose otherwise. And for the first time, my son looked uncertain, not angry, not dramatic, just unsure. And later, when Maya stepped out to speak with the nurse, my son leaned close and said I was letting a stranger take his place. And I told him she wasn't a stranger. She was just someone who showed up, and that's when he tried a softer tactic, saying he'd been overwhelmed, that the accident scared him, that he didn't know how to handle it. And I listened, but then the hospital social worker came in and asked if I wanted to review my medical proxy and estate planning documents, explaining that major accidents often trigger these reviews for patient protection. And she laid the papers on my bed, showing that my son was still listed as my default decision-maker. And before he could relax, she added that changes could be made immediately if I wished. And that was the next twist. Because the system was offering me a doorway he didn't know existed, and I asked for time to think. But later that afternoon, a billing specialist came to discuss insurance coverage and long-term care planning, and I noticed how Maya asked about my home, my independence, my recovery timeline, while my son asked about costs, assets, and whether selling property would be necessary. And I didn't confront either of them. I just listened, because sometimes the clearest truth is how people plan your future when they think you are not paying attention. And that evening, when my son left to check on things at home, Maya stayed behind and told me she'd never expected to be part of my life again, that she only came because she remembered how I treated her like she mattered when no one else did. And as she spoke, the hospital administrator returned with a consent form for medical advocacy updates, and I signed it slowly, calmly changing my primary medical proxy from my son to Maya. And when the administrator asked if I was sure, I said yes without hesitation. Because I wasn't choosing blood, I was choosing presence. And when my son returned later and saw the updated chart on the wall, he didn't yell or argue. He just stood there, quietly realizing that while he was planning a dinner party, someone else had stepped into a role he assumed was permanent. And that was the moment he understood control isn't inherited. It's earned. The shift didn't happen loudly. It happened through paperwork and small decisions that most people never notice, because the following morning a hospital legal liaison arrived to review my updated proxy forms and explain that changing a medical advocate often triggers a review of related financial and estate documents for patient protection. And as she spoke, my son stood near the door pretending to check messages while listening to every word. And when she asked if I wanted to schedule a follow-up meeting for long-term planning, I agreed. Not because I was ready to change everything, but because I wanted clarity. And that afternoon, a hospital attorney sat beside my bed and calmly explained how emergency situations often expose conflicts of interest, especially when family members control both medical and financial decisions. And she asked if I had ever formally separated those roles, and I told her no. And she nodded like she'd heard that answer 1,000 times, and then told me I could legally divide authority, so no single person could control both my care and my assets. And that was another twist, because I didn't even know that was possible. And while she spoke, my son texted me from the hallway saying Maya was overstepping, and that I should remember who my real family was, and I didn't reply, because the woman explaining legal structure felt more real than the man trying to protect a role. And later that day, when the billing office reviewed my insurance and long-term care options, they asked who should be listed as the primary contact for financial coordination. And before my son could step forward again, I said Maya's name, and the clerk updated the system without hesitation. And that single click quietly shifted authority in a way no argument ever could. And when my son finally came back into the room and saw Maya signing paperwork, he asked if I was pushing him out, and I told him I wasn't pushing anyone out. I was pulling myself back in. And then Maya told me something I didn't know, that when the hospital first called her, she thought it was a mistake. But she came anyway because 15 years ago, when she was a scared teenager with nowhere to go, I was the only adult who didn't treat her like a problem, and she said she kept my name because some people save your life without realizing it, and years later you get the chance to return it. And that night, when my son returned home to his house and his guests and his normal life, I lay in a hospital bed realizing that the accident didn't just reveal who cared. It revealed who planned my future without me. And that was the moment I understood the revenge wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be dramatic, and it wouldn't be cruel. It would be structural, legal, and permanent. Because the people who save you when you're powerless don't need your inheritance, and the people who plan your assets while you're unconscious don't deserve your trust. The pressure didn't come from my son directly at first. It came through other voices, other numbers, other concerned relatives who suddenly remembered I existed. Because within 2 days of my proxy changes, my phone started lighting up with calls from cousins, church friends, and distant family members asking how I was doing and whether I was thinking clearly. And the language was always soft, but the message was the same, that I should forgive, that accidents make people emotional, that family should handle family matters. And I listened without arguing because coordinated concern sounds different than genuine care. And later that afternoon, the hospital social worker informed me that my son had contacted them asking to review my decision-making capacity, which triggered an automatic evaluation protocol. And instead of panicking, I welcomed it, because systems favor documentation over drama. And when the evaluator arrived, she didn't ask about feelings or family conflict. She asked practical questions about my finances, my recovery plan, my living arrangements, and my understanding of my medical and legal decisions. And by the end of the assessment, she wrote that I was fully competent and acting independently, which became another official record my son couldn't rewrite. And that evening, Maya told me my son had approached her in the hallway and asked her to step back for the sake of family peace. And she told him she wasn't trying to replace anyone, she was just honoring the responsibility I gave her. And he walked away without arguing, because arguing with someone who doesn't need your approval feels pointless. And the next twist came when my attorney called to confirm that my son had attempted to access information about my estate plan through an old power of attorney document that was no longer valid, which meant he was already thinking ahead to assets and inheritance. And instead of confronting him, I authorized my attorney to update my will structure into a trust model that separated personal relationships from financial authority, meaning beneficiaries would receive what I chose without anyone controlling distribution. And when the draft arrived, I noticed how clean it was, how calm, how irreversible. And that night I signed the preliminary documents electronically, while Maya sat beside me holding my hand. Not because I was scared, but because the moment felt final in a way accidents never do. And when my son came the next morning and saw the legal packet on the bedside table, he didn't ask what it was. He just said, "You're changing everything." And I replied quietly, "I already had to." And in that moment, I saw the truth settle into his face. Not anger, not betrayal, but the realization that control delayed is control lost, and once it's gone, no apology can bring it back. The reconciliation attempt came packaged as kindness, because the next morning, my son arrived earlier than usual with coffee in his hand and a gentler voice than I'd heard in years, telling me he'd canceled work for the day and wanted to sit with me. And for a moment, it almost felt like the son I used to know. But then he started talking about how families fall apart over misunderstandings, and how lawyers and paperwork make everything colder than it needs to be. And I listened while he framed my decisions as fear and Maya's presence as confusion. and I noticed how every sentence carried the same hidden request: to restore him to the center of everything. And when I didn't respond the way he expected, he suggested a family meeting with a pastor and 2 relatives he trusted, saying they just wanted to support me through a difficult time. And that afternoon, the meeting happened in my hospital room with gentle voices and concerned looks. But the pastor asked questions about whether I felt pressured, whether I trusted Maya, whether I understood the consequences of changing inheritance plans, and I answered each question clearly, calmly, without hesitation. And that was another twist, because the more they tried to paint me as confused, the more structured and documented my clarity became. And when the pastor said forgiveness could restore peace, I said forgiveness doesn't require surrendering autonomy. And the room went quiet in a way no sermon could fill. And later, the hospital legal liaison informed me that the family meeting had been noted in my file as an external attempt to influence medical and financial decisions, which triggered an automatic safeguarding annotation, meaning any future attempts by relatives to intervene would be recorded as potential undue influence. And when my son heard that, his expression shifted from persuasion to realization, because every attempt to pull me back was now strengthening the very system that kept him out. And that evening, Maya showed me a message my son had sent her privately, asking if she'd consider stepping away in exchange for a thank you gift, which was polite enough to sound harmless, but transactional enough to reveal everything. And she refused without responding. And instead we sat together and reviewed the final draft of my trust document, where I had quietly redirected a significant portion of my estate to educational scholarships and a small fund in Maya's name to manage for students who needed the kind of support she once did. And when I signed that page, I didn't feel revenge. I felt alignment, because money, like attention, shows who mattered when no one was watching. And when my son returned that night and asked if we could start fresh, I told him we already were, but the structure of my life no longer depended on him choosing to be present. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't losing me. He was losing the assumption that he would always be at the center of my decisions, and that loss was something no apology could reverse. He didn't find out about the trust changes from me. He found out from his own attorney, which made the truth feel official in a way no conversation ever could. Because 2 days later, he walked into my room with a look that wasn't anger or guilt, but something closer to shock. And he asked why he had been listed as a beneficiary but no longer as an executor, and why a portion of my estate had been redirected into a scholarship fund with Maya's name attached. And I told him I wanted my money to do something meaningful without being controlled by anyone who saw me as an inconvenience. And that was another twist, because he realized this wasn't emotional revenge, it was architectural. And architecture is hard to tear down. And later that afternoon, I learned he had tried to contact Maya directly to ask her to decline the role for everyone's sake. But she forwarded me the message instead of responding. And I noticed how carefully he avoided mentioning money in the text, framing it as family unity, which told me he understood optics better than accountability. And when the hospital legal team scheduled a final confirmation meeting to formalize my discharge plan and trust activation, they invited both my son and Maya to observe, and during the meeting, the attorney explained that my decisions were voluntary, documented, and protected under elder autonomy statutes, and that any attempt to challenge them would require proof of incapacity, which had already been disproven by the earlier evaluation. And my son sat there quietly while the attorney explained that the trust would be irrevocable upon my discharge, meaning even I couldn't casually undo it. And that was the moment he understood this wasn't a phase, it was permanent. And when the attorney asked if I had any final statements for the record, I said I wanted my estate to reflect who showed up when I couldn't. And the room went quiet again, not dramatically, but in the way people go quiet when the truth lands cleanly. And afterward, my son pulled me aside and asked if I was trying to punish him, and I told him I wasn't punishing him, I was rewarding presence. And he said he never imagined a single holiday decision could change everything. And I said, decisions don't change everything. Patterns do. And that evening, Maya and I sat together while I reviewed the final trust confirmation on my tablet, and I noticed how calm I felt, because the accident had taken control away from my body for a moment. But it had given control back to my future, and when I pressed the final confirmation button, I realized I wasn't cutting anyone off. I was building something that would continue long after people stopped arguing about it. And that kind of quiet revenge doesn't fade. It compounds. The last attempt didn't come with lawyers or family meetings. It came with a voice memo my son sent at 2:17 a.m., a shaky recording where he sounded smaller than I'd ever heard him, telling me he kept replaying the night of the accident in his head and realizing how easily he could have lost me, and how he thought being a good son meant showing up when it was convenient instead of when it was necessary. And I listened to it once, then again, noticing how he never said the words I chose not to come. Only that things had gotten out of hand. And that was the next twist, because remorse often comes wrapped in soft language. And later that morning, the hospital arranged a discharge planning walkthrough for my apartment to make sure it was safe for my recovery. And when the occupational therapist arrived with Maya, my son joined us and started pointing out modifications he thought should be made, suggesting moving furniture, selling certain items, even talking about renting out part of the space for financial flexibility. And I realized he still thought my life was a project to optimize, not a person to ask. And while he was talking, Maya quietly asked the therapist about adjustments that would let me stay independent without changing my home, and the therapist nodded and wrote down Maya's suggestions instead. And that small professional validation shifted the room again, because authority was quietly aligning with presence. And later that afternoon, my attorney called to confirm that the trust activation had triggered notifications to financial institutions, which meant my son would no longer be able to access information about my accounts, even as a beneficiary. And when he found out, he asked if I was trying to erase him, and I told him I wasn't erasing him. I was separating love from leverage, and that night, he came back with an old photo album, showing me pictures of when he was a child, reminding me of school plays and road trips. And I realized nostalgia is another form of persuasion. And when he asked if those memories still mattered, I told him they did. But memories don't sign consent forms. And as he sat there flipping pages, I understood he was grieving something he never knew he had. The automatic authority that comes with being someone as only child. And that grief was quieter than anger, but deeper. And as I watched him leave that night, I realized the accident had fractured two timelines. The one where my son assumed he would always be in control, and the one where I finally learned I didn't need him to be. The day I left the hospital felt less like an ending and more like a quiet crossing, because the nurse wheeled me out past the same lobby where my son had once walked, in pretending he'd been there the whole time, and this time Maya stood beside me, holding my discharge folder, while my son followed a step behind like he wasn't sure what role he had anymore. And when we arrived at my apartment, I noticed he kept pointing out changes he thought we should make, installing cameras, adding financial monitoring software, giving him shared access just in case. And I listened without interrupting. Because sometimes people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they're being helpful. And while he was talking, my attorney called to confirm that the trust had been officially recorded with the county, and that my son's name had been removed from any decision-making authority beyond his beneficiary status, meaning he couldn't sign, override, or manage anything even in emergencies. And when I told him that, he didn't argue. He just asked if there was any way to reverse it, and I said not without a court challenge and medical proof that I wasn't competent. And that twist landed heavier than any fight, because control feels permanent until the law decides it isn't. And that evening, my phone started buzzing again with family messages, some supportive, some confused, some asking why I'd chosen a former student over my own son. And instead of explaining, I posted a short message in our family group chat saying I was grateful to everyone who showed up and that I had updated my plans to reflect who I trusted, and the silence that followed felt louder than criticism. Because clarity leaves no room for argument. And later that night, Maya helped me unpack my hospital bag and asked if I was nervous about the changes ID made. And I told her I wasn't nervous about change. I was nervous about staying in a system where my voice could be overridden. And when my son overheard that, he paused in the hallway like he was finally hearing me for the first time. And in that moment, I realized the accident didn't just change my future. It exposed how easily people confuse familiarity with entitlement, and how quietly you can reclaim yourself without shouting, without cutting people off, just by building a structure where no one can make decisions for you without you ever again. The challenge didn't come directly from my son at first. It came through silence and paperwork, because 2 days after I returned home, my attorney called to inform me that my son had scheduled a private legal consultation to understand his rights as a beneficiary. And while that sounded harmless on the surface, the timing told a different story, because the same afternoon, a notice arrived from the trust registry confirming that my estate structure had been fully recorded and classified as irrevocable, which meant even a legal challenge would require proof of coercion or incapacity, neither of which existed. And that detail mattered more than any argument, because it meant his questions had no leverage behind them. And later that evening he came by with a careful tone and said he'd spoken to a lawyer who told him challenging the trust would publicly reopen the hospital records and call logs from the night of the accident, including the refusal log. And I saw the weight of that realization settle on his face, because for the first time he understood that fighting me would also expose him. And while he sat there processing that, Maya arrived with groceries and quietly started preparing dinner without asking permission or trying to take control, just moving like someone who belonged without needing to prove it. And that contrast mattered, because presence doesn't announce itself. It just shows up consistently. And during dinner, my son tried to shift the conversation toward reconciliation again, talking about holidays, family traditions, and how we could move forward. And I listened. But then he asked if I'd consider revisiting the trust structure in the future. And I told him the structure wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary, and boundaries aren't temporary. And later that night, Maya showed me a message she received from one of my relatives asking why she was in the middle of family business. And she replied with one sentence, "I'm not in the middle. I'm here by invitation." And that line stayed with me, because it captured everything this had become. And when my attorney emailed to confirm that all future estate communications would go through her office and the fiduciary, not family, I realized my son's legal consultation had actually accelerated the very protections he feared, because systems respond to intent, and his intent had been documented. And as I went to bed that night, I understood the revenge wasn't emotional, it wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel. It was procedural, because the more he tried to find a way back into control, the more permanently the system closed around my independence. When the legal route closed for him, my son shifted to something quieter, but just as strategic, narrative control. Because within days, I started hearing stories about myself before anyone spoke to me directly, neighbors asking gently if I was doing okay mentally, church friends checking in to see if I was being influenced, and a distant aunt calling to ask if Maya was some kind of caretaker company. And I recognized the pattern immediately. Not confrontation, not challenge, but doubt, the kind that spreads without fingerprints. And instead of reacting, I documented it, because patterns matter more than conversations. And later that afternoon, my attorney forwarded me a notice from a community legal advocacy group confirming that any attempt to socially discredit a legally competent adult in order to influence their estate decisions could qualify as undue influence under elder protection statutes. And that single line shifted the entire board because it meant even rumors could become evidence. And that evening, Maya showed me a post in a private family group where someone had written that I was confused since the accident and not making rational decisions. And instead of defending myself, I asked my attorney to file a formal autonomy affirmation statement in my county records, which publicly documented my competency, independence, and voluntary estate planning. And when it was processed, the system sent confirmations to medical, legal, and financial registries, meaning any future claim of incapacity would now be legally contradicted by record. And the next twist came when my pastor asked if I'd like to address the congregation briefly after Sunday service, not to explain myself, but simply to share a recovery update. And I agreed, because visibility beats rumor. And when I stood at the front of the church with Maya beside me and thanked everyone for their prayers and support and said I had chosen people who showed up when I couldn't to speak for myself, I didn't name my son. I didn't accuse anyone. I just spoke about gratitude and clarity, and I watched the room change. Because dignity reframes stories faster than defense. And afterward, people came up to Maya to thank her for being there for me. And I saw something shift in how the community recognized her, not as an outsider, but as chosen family. And that night, my son texted me saying things were getting out of hand, and that I was making him look bad without saying his name. And I replied that truth doesn't need targeting, and for the first time, he didn't respond. Because narratives collapse when systems, records, and public dignity align. And as I went to bed, I realized he had tried to rewrite the story quietly, but structure had already written it louder than words ever could. The next shift didn't come through law or rumor. It came through pressure, because suddenly Maya became the target instead of me, receiving polite but loaded messages from extended family asking who she really was, what her role in my life actually meant, and whether she was benefiting from my situation. And I watched her read them quietly without responding, because dignity doesn't explain itself. And that same afternoon, my financial advisor suggested something that reframed everything again. A transparency report, a formal public-facing summary of my trust structure, donations, and allocations that could be shared with institutions and organizations I supported, not to justify my choices, but to make them visible. And I approved it, because secrecy feeds suspicion and clarity kills it. And when the report was finalized, it showed not just where my money was going, but why. Scholarships, community programs, healthcare support, and a small personal fund for Maya to manage on behalf of students who reminded her of herself. And suddenly my estate wasn't a family conflict anymore. It was a community structure, and that was a powerful twist, because once money becomes purpose instead of inheritance, arguments lose their power. And later that evening, my son called and said he had seen the transparency report and asked why I was involving so many people outside the family. And I told him I wasn't involving them. I was investing in them. And he said it felt like I was replacing family with strangers. And I said I was replacing entitlement with intention. And that night, as Maya and I sat together reviewing letters from scholarship organizations thanking me for the initiative, I realized something deeper was happening. The accident had transformed my future from a private legacy into a public good. And when my son texted again asking if there was still space for him in my life, I replied that there would always be space for him as my son, but never again as my manager. And that line felt like a hinge point because it didn't close a door. It changed the rules of the room. And as I turned off the lights, I understood that revenge doesn't quite always isolate you. Sometimes it connects you to a wider world that no one can control. The reconciliation attempt didn't stay private this time. It went public because my son showed up unannounced at a community fundraiser hosted by the scholarship program I had just launched, standing beside me in front of people who now associated my name with opportunity and purpose. And he introduced himself as my son in a way that sounded more like a credential than a relationship. And when he thanked me publicly for my generosity and said how proud he was of the work I was doing, I realized he was trying to reattach himself to a narrative he no longer controlled, and I smiled and thanked him back without adding details, because sometimes silence is louder than correction, and during the event, Maya spoke with several students and donors. And I watched how naturally people gravitated toward her, not because of money, but because of how she listened. And later that evening, the program director asked if Maya would consider serving as an official advisor for the scholarship committee. And I agreed immediately, because authority that grows from service feels different than authority that comes from blood. And when my son heard that she would be listed publicly as a representative of my foundation, his expression shifted again, because now Maya wasn't just part of my private life. She was part of my public legacy. And after the event, he pulled me aside and said he felt like he was being erased from my story. And I told him he was still part of my story, just not the editor. And that line landed harder than any accusation. And the next twist came when my attorney emailed me a draft of a naming clause for the scholarship fund, suggesting it carry the name of the teacher who had first helped Maya. And when I saw my own name paired with hers in the draft, I realized the fund would symbolically connect us forever. And I approved it, because symbolism outlives arguments. And when the announcement went live on the Foundation's website, listing Maya as co-steward and honoring my role as founder, my son saw it before I even told him, and he messaged me asking if this meant she would inherit everything someday. And I told him inheritances are about distribution, legacies are about direction, and he didn't respond, because for the first time he understood that this wasn't about replacing him. It was about redefining what mattered. And as I stood in my living room that night, looking at the scholarship website on my laptop, I realized I had turned a private betrayal into a public mission. And once a mission exists, personal conflicts shrink into footnotes. The final appeal came in the form of vulnerability, because a week after the fundraiser, my son asked if we could meet alone. Just the two of us, no lawyers, no Maya, no family observers. And when he arrived, he looked tired in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, telling me he felt like he was losing me and didn't recognize the world we were building anymore. And for the first time, he admitted that the accident had scared him, not just because he might have lost me, but because he realized how little he actually knew about my inner life. And while he spoke, I realized fear can make people reach for control or connection, and he had chosen control first, connection second, and that order matters. And when he asked if I still trusted him at all, I told him trust doesn't vanish, it just changes shape. And that night, my attorney finalized the naming clause for the Scholarship Foundation and filed the official paperwork linking my name and Maya S. as co-stewards of the Legacy Fund, which meant long after I was gone, decisions would be guided by the values we shared, not by whoever inherited the title. And when my son saw the announcement in the local paper the next morning, he didn't call me immediately. He posted a short message publicly congratulating me and Maya, and I realized he was learning how to exist in a story he didn't control. And later that day, several relatives who had once questioned my decisions reached out to Maya directly to offer support and volunteer. And I watched how quickly narratives change when purpose becomes visible. And when my son finally called, he asked if there was anything he could do that would actually matter now. And I told him presence matters when it's consistent, not when it's convenient. And as I hung up, I felt something settle that wasn't revenge or anger, but closure, because the accident had given me a lens to see which relationships were built on assumption and which were built on action. And that clarity had become the foundation of everything I was building next. The reconciliation plan he brought this time wasn't emotional. It was structured, because a few days after our private meeting, my son sent me a detailed proposal outlining how he wanted to be involved in my life going forward. Scheduling weekly visits, volunteering with the scholarship fund, and even taking a course on elder advocacy. And while it looked sincere on paper, I noticed how it still framed involvement as something he needed to formalize, like a role he could earn back through tasks instead of trust. And I thanked him for the effort, but told him relationships aren't projects. And that night, Maya officially accepted her position on the scholarship committee, which meant she now attended meetings, reviewed applications, and spoke on behalf of the foundation publicly. And I watched her confidence grow as people began to associate her name with opportunity and guidance. And the next twist came when a regional nonprofit contacted me, asking if I would consider expanding the fund into a mentorship program for at-risk students. And I agreed, because impact multiplies when you stop keeping it personal. And when the announcement went out listing me as founder and Maya as program director, my son called again and asked if he could join the mentorship board. And I told him he could apply like anyone else. And that was the moment he realized there was no special doorway left for him, only the same doors everyone else used. And later that week, my attorney finalized the last piece of my estate plan by placing a clause that required any future amendments to be reviewed by an independent ethics committee tied to the foundation, which meant even if family pressure resurfaced later, decisions would be filtered through values, not blood. And as I signed that clause, I felt something close to peace, because structures don't get lonely. And when my son visited that weekend and saw Maya on a video call with students discussing college plans, he sat quietly and listened. And afterward, he told me he never realized how far a small kindness could travel. And I told him, kindness travels farther than obligation, and as he left, I understood that the world I was building was no longer a reaction to betrayal. It was an ecosystem of intention, and ecosystems don't collapse just because one person changes their mind. The first time I saw my son sitting quietly in the mentorship meeting, taking notes instead of taking charge, I realized something fundamental had shifted, because he wasn't there as my heir or my representative. He was there as a volunteer, another adult in a room full of people trying to do something meaningful. And when Maya introduced him to the students simply as a community member who wanted to help, I watched him accept that title without correction, which felt like a quiet surrender of entitlement and the beginning of something healthier. And later that evening, my attorney delivered the final legacy package for my signature, including a declaration of chosen family, a legal statement naming Maya as a lifelong steward of my foundation and recognizing her as family by designation, not by blood. And when I signed it, it felt less like paperwork and more like closing a circle that had opened 15 years ago in a classroom where a frightened girl stayed late because she didn't want to go home. And the next twist came when my son asked if he could be present for the signing, not to challenge it, but to witness it. And he stood beside me as I finalized everything. His name still there as my son, but no longer at the center of control. And afterward he told me he understood that being family doesn't mean being in charge, and being loved doesn't mean being owed. And when I looked at Maya and saw her holding the signed documents with the same careful respect she'd shown the night she ran through a storm to save me, I knew I had built something that would outlast apologies and arguments. And in the weeks that followed, the mentorship program expanded. The scholarship fund grew, and my home became a place where students, neighbors, and volunteers gathered to plan futures that had nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with possibility. And my son started coming over on Sundays, not to manage anything, not to suggest changes, but to cook, listen, and learn. And one night, he asked if I ever regretted choosing someone outside the family. And I told him I didn't choose outside the family. I chose the people who acted like family, and that was the moment I felt the last weight lift. Because revenge had never been about taking something from him. It had been about giving my life direction that no one could quietly rewrite again. And as I sat on my porch watching Maya laugh with students in the yard and my son washing dishes inside without being asked, I realized the accident hadn't ended my story. It had rewritten it. And the woman who once lay unconscious while someone else decided her fate had woken up and built a system, a family, and a legacy where no one could ever choose convenience over her life again. And in that calm, ordinary evening, I finally understood that the strongest form of revenge isn't punishment, it's permanence, because when you build something that reflects your values, even the people who failed you end up living inside the world you created. Blood made him my son. Choice made her my family. If you enjoyed this quiet revenge story about betrayal, dignity, and chosen family, like the video and subscribe to Payback Files Stories. New emotional stories are uploaded regularly. Comment below. Who would you choose if you had to rewrite your legacy?